You know, they say that when you reach a certain level of success, the world is supposed to open up for you. They say the doors swing wide, the red carpets roll out, and you finally get to breathe that thin, expensive air at the top of the mountain. I've spent 20 years building an empire from nothing but a shared desk and a lot of sleepless nights. I'm the guy people call when they need $1 million problem solved by yesterday. But let me tell you something, brother. That mountain has a way of turning into a glass cage the moment you take off the suit. I was sitting in seat 2A, first class, on a flight headed to Atlanta. Now, if you looked at my bank account that morning, you'd see numbers that most people only dream about. But if you looked at me, man, you would have seen a ghost. I was wearing this old, oversized gray hoodie, the kind that's seen too many winters and has a permanent stain from some coffee I spilled 3 years ago. My jeans were baggy and caked with dried mud around the cuffs. My boots, scuffed, heavy, and looking like they belonged in a construction trench, not on a plush carpet. I hadn't showered in 48 hours. I'd just finished a charity build in a rainy, muddy corner of Ohio, physically swinging hammers and hauling lumber with my own 2 hands to help build a community center for kids who didn't have a place to go. I was exhausted. My bones ached. My eyes were bloodshot from the lack of sleep. And I looked every bit like a man who didn't have a nickel to his name. I could have changed. I had a suitcase full of Italian silk and tailored wool. But I was tired. I was just done. I wanted to see if I could just be a man, a tired human being, and get home in peace. I remember the silence of that first-class cabin. You know, that specific kind of silence. It's not a peaceful one. It's the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. It's heavy. It's pointed. From the second I stepped onto that plane, the air changed. It went from the smell of expensive perfume and fresh coffee to the sharp, cold scent of judgment before we even take off. I want to ask you something. I really want you to sit with this. Have you ever walked into a room, a place you paid to be, a place you earned your way into, and felt the temperature drop 40 degrees just because of how you looked? If you've ever felt that weight on your chest, do me a favor. Tell me where you're watching this from in the comments. I need to know who's out there listening, who understands what it feels like to be a suspicious character in your own life. And if you find any value in what I'm sharing, hit that subscribe button. We need to stick together in this world. So, I'm sitting there, trying to adjust my seat, and I feel it, that prickle on the back of my neck. I look to my right, and there's this woman in 2B. She's dressed in head-to-toe designer gear, looking like she just walked off a catalog shoot. The moment our eyes met, she didn't see a human being. She saw a threat. She didn't even try to hide it. She pulled her leather handbag, a bag that probably cost more than some people make in a month, closer to her chest. She clutched it so tight her knuckles turned white. She shifted her entire body toward the window, like she was trying to create a physical barrier between her world and mine. I just wanted to close my eyes. Man, my head was throbbing. But then the flight attendant comes by, a young woman, sharp uniform, professional smile, until she gets to my row. She hands out warm towels to the guy in 1A. She laughs at a joke from the couple in 1B. Then she gets to me. That smile. It didn't just fade, it evaporated. It was like a shutter slamming shut on a window. "Ticket?" she asked. Her voice wasn't warm. It was clipped, hard, like she was talking to someone who had just wandered in off the street to beg for a meal. I didn't say a word. I just pointed to the mobile pass on my phone, which was sitting on the tray table. She stared at it for a long second. probably hoping it was a fake or a mistake. When she realized it was legitimate, she didn't apologize. She didn't offer me a drink or a towel. She just moved on to 2B, her voice instantly turning back into honey for the woman next to me. Would you like a glass of champagne before we depart? Mom. I felt that familiar burn in my throat. It's a mix of anger and this deep, long, this heart-wrenching sadness. You spend your whole life proving you're one of the good ones, building businesses, giving back, wearing the mask of the professional CEO, and all it takes is a dirty hoodie for the world to remind you that, to them, you're still just a problem to be handled. But the flight attendant wasn't the one I was worried about. It was the man sitting across the aisle in 2C. He was a big guy, probably in his late 50s, with a thick neck and a haircut that screamed law enforcement or military. He had these eyes, cold, blue, and restless. He wasn't looking at his magazine. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was looking at me, not just a glance, but a full-on, predatory stare, the kind of look a wolf gives a stray dog it's about to tear apart. I saw him lean over and whisper something to his wife. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the way he gestured toward me with his chin. I saw the way his wife's eyes widened, and how she suddenly looked at me with this mix of fear and disgust. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a man who felt he had a duty to protect this cabin from someone like me. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, trying to think about the faces of those kids back in Ohio when they saw the new community center. I tried to focus on the good I'd done. But the tension in that cabin was building like steam in a pressure cooker. You could feel it in the way people whispered, the way the flight attendants kept walking past my seat, glancing at my muddy boots, then whispering to each other near the galley. I felt like an animal in a cage, a very expensive, leather-lined cage. I reached up to the overhead vent to get some air, and as I moved, my hoodie sleeve pulled back, revealing my watch. It's a piece I bought myself after my first successful merger. Subtle, but anyone who knows anything about watches knows it's worth a small fortune. The woman in 2B saw it. She didn't look impressed. She looked horrified. In her mind, there was no way a man who looked like me could own something like that honestly. I saw her hand go to her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. Then, the officer in 2C stood up. He didn't go to the bathroom. He walked into the galley and started talking to the lead flight attendant. They were both looking at me. He was pointing. He was talking with his hands, his face getting a little redder with every word. He looked like a man who was convinced he'd just spotted a criminal infiltrating his sanctuary. I knew what was coming. I've lived in this skin for 45 years. I know the rhythm of this dance. It starts with the looks, moves to the whispers, and ends with the confrontation. My heart started to thud against my ribs, that slow, heavy beat that comes when you know you're about to be forced into a fight you didn't ask for. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. I wasn't scared of them. I was scared of what I might do if they pushed me too far. I was scared of the anger I'd been keeping under lock and key for 2 decades. I needed to distract myself. I needed to work. I thought maybe if they saw me working, if they saw the complexity of the spreadsheets and the high-level data on my screen, they'd realize their mistake. I'd show them I wasn't just a body in a seat. I was a mind they couldn't even begin to comprehend. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady my hands. The cabin lights dimmed as we began to taxi toward the runway, but the shadows in the corners seemed to press in closer. I reached down slowly, carefully, making sure my movements were visible and non-threatening, and grabbed the handle of my rugged, dirt-stained backpack tucked under the seat in front of me. as I pulled the heavy bag onto my lap. The zipper caught for a second, making a sharp, metallic scratching sound that seemed to echo through the entire silent cabin. I felt every eye in the first-class section lock onto me. The woman next to me literally recoiling into the wall of the plane as I gripped the bag tight, my fingers trembling slightly as I began to undo the clasp. The metal teeth of that zipper felt like they were biting into the very air of the cabin, and I could feel the collective intake of breath from the people around me. I didn't look up, not yet. I kept my head down, staring at the worn canvas of my bag, because I knew that if I met their eyes, I'd see a reflection of a man I didn't recognize, a version of myself that they had already constructed in their minds. I reach inside, my fingers brushing against the cool, brushed aluminum of my laptop. It's a custom-built machine, a beast of a workstation that costs more than most people's first cars. To me, it's a tool, a reservoir of my life's work, my late nights, and the digital blueprints of the future I'm trying to build. But as I pulled it out, the sleek, silver surface catching the dim LED cabin lights, the atmosphere didn't just stay tense, it curdled. The woman in 2B didn't just flinch this time. She let out a sharp, audible gasp that sounded like a tea kettle hitting its boiling point. I heard the frantic rustle of her silk sleeves as she pressed herself even harder against the window, her eyes darting from the high-end tech in my hands to my mud-stained hoodie. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, grinding out the only logical conclusion her bias would allow. He stole it. There was no world in her reality where a man who looked like a drifter, a man who smelled of rain and manual labor, could rightfully own something that expensive. I felt that heavy, familiar weight settling in my gut. It's a weight I thought I'd shed years ago when I made my first million. Or maybe when I saw my face on the cover of that business magazine. But it never really goes away. Does it? It's always there, lurking in the shadows of the American dream, waiting for the moment you step out of your lane. I opened the lid, the screen glowing to life and illuminating the lines on my face, the salt and pepper in my beard that I usually keep so neatly trimmed. Now, I just looked ragged. I looked suspicious. The flight attendant, the one with the evaporating smile, appeared at my side like a ghost. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't offer a beverage. She just stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on my laptop with a look of pure, unadulterated skepticism. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing that professional lilt entirely. "I'm going to have to ask you to put that away for takeoff. The sign isn't on yet," I replied, my voice low and steady. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was trying to hold on to a shred of my own agency. I needed to finish an email to my lead architect before we lost signal. "I'll close it the moment we start to move." She didn't leave. She hovered. "We have safety protocols, sir, and there have been some concerns expressed by your fellow passengers about your behavior." I finally looked up. I looked her right in the eye, and for a split second, I saw her blink. She saw the CEO in my eyes, even if she couldn't see it through the hoodie. But she didn't back down. She couldn't. She had the backing of the entire civilized cabin behind her. Across the aisle, the officer in 2C wasn't just staring anymore. He was leaning out into the aisle, his thick arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a hard, jagged line. He looked like he was just waiting for the signal to pounce. I could feel his energy. It was aggressive, hungry, and entirely convinced of its own righteousness. He was the protector of the good people, and I was the intruder. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice booming through the quiet cabin. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. He didn't wait for the flight attendant to answer. He turned his cold, blue gaze directly on me. You heard the lady. Put the computer away. And maybe explain where a guy in a hoodie like that gets a machine like this. The woman in 2B piped up then, her voice trembling but emboldened by the man's presence. He was digging through that bag so frantically. And look at him. He doesn't belong here. I saw him looking at my purse earlier. I think he might have taken something. The lie hung in the air like a thick, poisonous fog. I didn't even look at her purse. I hadn't even acknowledged her presence until she started treating me like a leper. But in this cabin, at this altitude, her word was gold and mine was lead. I felt a surge of that long pain again. That heart-wrenching realization that no matter how much I give back, no matter how many jobs I create or how many communities I rebuild, I am always just one concerned citizen away from being a criminal. I thought about my father, a man who spent 40 years working in a factory, who told me I had to be twice as good to get half as far. I thought I'd surpassed that. I thought I'd won the game. But here I was, being interrogated in a seat I paid $3,000 for. I felt the anger bubbling up. A hot, dark tide. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to yell. I wanted to show them my bank balance, my ID, my credentials. I wanted to make them feel as small as they were making me feel. But I knew the script. If a black man gets angry, he's aggressive. If he raises his voice, he's a threat. If he stands up, he's resisting. So, I stayed seated. I moved slowly, deliberately. I closed the laptop. The click of the lid sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I tucked it back into my bag. I haven't touched your purse. Ma'am, I said, my voice vibrating with a restraint that felt like it might snap my vocal cords. I'm just a passenger trying to get home. Just like you. Likely story. The officer scoffed. He was unbuckling his seatbelt now, the click of the metal buckle sharp and decisive. He stood up, towering over me in the narrow aisle. He wasn't on duty, but he was carrying that invisible badge, that sense of entitlement that told him he had the right to police my existence. I've seen your type 1,000 times. You think you can blend in? You think you can pull a fast one in first class because nobody wants to make a scene? Well, I'm making a scene. The flight attendant stepped back, not to stop him, but to give him room. She was looking at him with relief, like a knight in shining armor had just arrived to slay the dragon. Sir, please sit down. We are about to taxi, she said. But it was a half-hearted request, more of a formality than a command. Not until I see some ID, the officer said, ignoring her and focusing entirely on me. He took a step closer, invading my personal space, the smell of his expensive aftershave clashing with the faint, earthy scent of the mud on my boots. I want to see your ticket and I want to see your identification. Right now, I'm an officer of the law, and I have reason to suspect you're traveling under false pretenses or in possession of stolen property. I looked up at him, my neck beginning to ache from the angle. The cabin around us had gone completely still. Everyone was watching, some with fear, some with a sick kind of curiosity. But nobody, not one person, spoke up for me. I was alone in a room full of people. I reached into the pocket of my hoodie, my hand closing around my wallet. It was a simple, worn leather wallet, nothing flashy. As my fingers touched the leather, I felt a strange calm wash over me, the calm of a man who knows he's reached the point of no return. I knew that the moment I pulled that wallet out, the situation would escalate. If I gave it to him, I was submitting to an illegal search by a man with no jurisdiction. If I refused, I was non-compliant. I looked at the officer, really looked at him. I saw the veins bulging in his neck, the way his hand hovered near his hip, as if he were reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for a win. He was looking to put me in my place. I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket. But I didn't have my wallet. I just had my phone. I didn't say a word as I tapped the screen, the blue light reflecting in the officer's angry eyes. I began to record. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his face turning a deeper shade of crimson. "I'm documenting this encounter," I said, my voice sounding incredibly loud in the hushed cabin. "You are an off-duty officer harassing a paying passenger. I want to make sure I have a record of everything you say." The woman in 2B let out another gasp. This one sharper. "He's being combative. Did you see that? He's threatening us." The officer took another step, his chest almost touching my shoulder. He was trying to intimidate me into submission, trying to use his bulk to crush my resolve. He reached out, his hand grasping the top of my seat back, his knuckles white, his shadow falling over me like a heavy, dark shroud as the plane suddenly lurched forward, beginning its slow, ominous crawl toward the runway. The vibration of the plane's engines began to rattle the floorboards beneath my scuffed boots, a low-frequency hum that seemed to sync up with the thundering pulse in my ears. As the aircraft made that heavy, swaying turn toward the main runway, the officer didn't flinch. He didn't go back to his seat to buckle up like the safety lights commanded. He just stood there, a wall of flesh and misplaced authority. His hand still gripped on my headrest so hard I could hear the leather groaning. I looked at my phone screen, the little red recording, dot blinking like a warning light on a dashboard. It was my only witness. In this world, a man who looks like I did in that moment, disheveled, dark-skinned, draped in a muddy hoodie, doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. We get the benefit of the handcuffs. We get the benefit of the doubt being cast on our very right to breathe. I felt that old, familiar tightness in my chest, a sensation like a thick iron band being cranked tighter with every breath. It's a weight that no amount of money in my bank account has ever been able to fully lift. "Put that phone down," the man growled, his voice dropping into a register that was meant to trigger fear. It was the voice of a man used to people trembling when he spoke. "You're in the air, miles from your jurisdiction, and you're off duty," I said, my voice sounding incredibly calm, even to my own ears. It was the CEO voice, the one I use when a board meeting is falling apart or when a multi-million-dollar deal is on the verge of collapsing. It's a voice made of cold steel and absolute certainty. And right now, you're the only one interfering with anything. You're standing during taxiing. You're harassing a passenger. If this plane has to stop because of you, I wonder how the airline is going to feel about that. His face went from a dull red to a deep, bruised purple. I saw his eyes flick to the phone, then back to my face. He was calculating. He wanted to snatch it. I could see the twitch in his fingers. But he knew that in a cabin full of witnesses, even silent ones, assaulting a man on camera was a bad move. Instead, he turned his head and barked toward the galley. "Miss, where is the lead purser? We have a non-compliant passenger here who is filming me and potentially compromising the safety of this flight. I need the captain notified immediately." The flight attendant, who had been hovering a few feet away with a look of panicked approval, nodded vigorously. She didn't look at me once. She didn't ask for my side. She just turned and practically ran toward the cockpit. The woman in 2B, the one who had started this whole fire by clutching her purse like it was the Holy Grail, let out a shaky, dramatic breath. Thank God. She whispered loud enough for the whole row to hear. I didn't feel safe. The way he was digging through that bag. You just never know these days. I closed my eyes for a second. And in that darkness, I didn't see the airplane cabin. I saw my 12-year-old son, Marcus. I saw his bright, innocent face, his eyes full of the belief that the world is a fair place because his dad told him so. I thought about the talk, not the one about birds and bees, but the one every black father in America has to give. The one about keeping your hands visible. The one about speaking softly. The one about how your dignity is a luxury you sometimes have to trade for your life. It broke my heart. It was truly long to realize that even as I sat in the seat I'd earned through decades of sweat, I was still having to give that talk to myself. I was 45 years old, a pillar of my community, a man who had provided jobs for hundreds of families, and I was currently being treated like a stray dog that had snuck into a garden party. The humiliation wasn't a sharp pain. It was a dull, heavy ache that settled into my marrow. It was the realization that to these people, the suit was the man, and without it, I was nothing but a shadow. The lead purser arrived then. He was an older man, sharp-eyed, with a face that looked like it had seen every type of passenger drama imaginable. But the moment he saw the officer standing there, looking all authoritative, and then saw me, the guy in the mud-caked hoodie, his expression hardened into a very specific kind of mold. "What seems to be the trouble?" the purser asked, his eyes sweeping over me with a cold, professional disdain. This man is acting suspiciously, refusing to follow crew instructions, and is currently filming me without consent after I identified myself as an officer, the guy in 2C said, puffing out his chest. The lady next to him also believes he may have tampered with her personal property. "I'm recommending we have law enforcement meet the plane in Atlanta, and if he continues to be non-compliant, we might need to turn this bird around." The purser looked at me. "Sir, is this true? Are you refusing to stow your electronic devices and filming other passengers?" "I am filming for my own safety," I said, keeping the phone steady, "because I am being harassed by a man who has no right to demand my ID, and I am being accused of a crime by a woman who hasn't even looked inside her bag to see if anything is missing. I paid for this seat. I have followed every safety instruction until this man stood up and started threatening me." The purser didn't even blink. "I need you to hand over your phone." "Sir?" "And I need to see your ticket and identification immediately. We cannot have a security incident in the first-class cabin." A security incident. I let out a short, dry laugh that had no humor in it. "The only incident here is the profiling. I will show you my ID. I have nothing to hide. But I will not stop recording, and I will not hand over my property." I reached into the pocket of my hoodie. The officer flinched, his hand dropping toward his waist in a purely instinctive, terrifying motion. The woman in 2B shrieked. It was a small, sharp sound that made my blood run cold. They were so primed to see me as a gunman, as a thug, as a monster, that even reaching for a wallet was seen as a lethal threat. I moved with agonizing slowness. I used 2 fingers to fish out my leather wallet. I didn't open it. I didn't toss it. I held it out like a peace offering, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack a bone. "Here," I said, my voice a whisper of suppressed rage and profound exhaustion. "Here is the proof that I am allowed to exist in this space." The purser took the wallet, his movements jerky. He opened it and stared at my driver's license. Then he looked at the name on the manifest he held in his other hand. I watched his eyes. I watched them move back and forth. He saw the name. He saw the address. But he didn't see me. He saw a name that belonged to a CEO, and then he looked at the man in the hoodie, and his brain simply refused to bridge the gap. He assumed it was a fake. He assumed I was an imposter. "This ID says you're Robert Vance," the purser said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "The Robert Vance of Vance Global. That's me," I said. The officer let out a loud, mocking snort. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England. Look at him, Jerry. He looks like he just crawled out of a sewer. You think a guy who runs a billion-dollar firm travels looking like a vagrant? I've been working," I said, my eyes boring into the officers. "I've been doing things you wouldn't understand. Building things, not just tearing people down." The purser handed the wallet back, but his face didn't soften. "We'll verify this upon arrival. For now, sir, you are to remain in your seat. Do not open that laptop again. Do not speak to the other passengers. If you move, if you even unbuckle that belt before the captain gives the word, I will have the air marshal on board. Intervene. Do you understand?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the officer and whispered, "Please, sir, take your seat for now. We'll handle this the moment the wheels touch the ground. We have the authorities on standby." The officer smirked. It was a slow, oily grin that made my skin crawl. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, and whispered, "You think you're smart with that phone? You think that name is going to save you? Wait until we get to the gate. I'm going to make sure they run every finger you've got through the system. I'm going to enjoy watching you walk out of here in zip ties." He sat back down, buckled his belt, and winked at his wife. The woman in 2B leaned away from me, her face twisted in a mask of triumph, as if she'd just personally caught a high-profile criminal. The plane roared, the engine screaming as we finally accelerated down the runway. I felt the G-force pushing me back into my seat, but it didn't feel like flight. It felt like being pressed into a coffin. I looked out the window as the ground fell away, the lights of the city shrinking into tiny, distant sparks. Up here, in the clouds, the world was supposed to be beautiful and vast, but inside this pressurized metal tube, it was the smallest, ugliest place I had ever been. I sat there in the dim light, the silence of the cabin returning, but it was a poisonous silence now. I didn't put the phone away. I kept it gripped in my hand, the screen dark, but ready. I stared straight ahead at the back of the seat in front of me. My jaw set so tight it felt like granite. I wasn't just a man on a flight anymore. I was a man on a mission. The pain in my heart had turned into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. They wanted a show. They wanted a security incident. Fine. As the fasten seatbelt sign finally dinged off an hour later, signaling our descent into the humid Georgia night, I saw the officer already checking his watch and tapping his phone. A smug, expectant look on his face as he stared at the cabin door, waiting for the moment he could finally see me broken. I just sat there, my fingers interlaced over my chest, watching the clouds break as the first flickers of the Atlanta skyline began to rise up to meet us like a judgment. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jarring thud that sent a shudder through the entire frame of the Boeing 757. A violent reminder that no matter how high you fly, you eventually have to come back down to earth. I felt that impact in my very marrow. For the last hour, the cabin had been a tomb of silent judgment. The officer in 2C had spent the entire descent checking his reflection in his phone screen, smoothing down his hair, and adjusting his shirt as if he were preparing to receive a Medal of Honor. The woman next to me had already unbuckled her seatbelt the second the chime sounded, standing up and hovering in the aisle like she couldn't wait to be the first one to tell her version of the truth to whoever was waiting at the door. I didn't move. I kept my hands folded, my mud-stained hoodie feeling heavier than it ever had before. I looked out the window as the plane taxied toward the gate, the blue and yellow runway lights blurring into long, streaking lines of neon. Atlanta, my home, the city where I'd built high-rises, where I'd funded schools, and where, apparently, I was still just a man in a suspicious hoodie. Almost showtime. "Buddy," the officer muttered, loud enough for the rows behind us to hear. He leaned over the aisle, his eyes gleaming with a sick kind of excitement. "Hope you enjoyed your little CEO fantasy while it lasted. The real world is waiting for you at the jet bridge." I didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. I just watched the ground crew outside, their orange wands waving the plane into its final position. The engines wind down, a long, mournful sigh that echoed the state of my own spirit. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of overhead bins being popped open and the rustle of people grabbing their expensive luggage. The lead purser walked back up to the front, his face a mask of cold efficiency. He stood by the cockpit door, blocking the exit, his eyes fixed on me. "Mr. Vance," he said, using the name with a sneer that made it clear he didn't believe it for a second. "Please remain in your seat until the authorities have entered the cabin. Everyone else, please move to the back of the aircraft to allow room for the officers." The woman in 2B didn't move to the back. She stood right there next to the officer, both of them forming a makeshift welcoming committee of hate. I felt the air conditioning hum in the ceiling, a thin, cold stream of air hitting the top of my head. I felt the sweat on the back of my neck cooling. I was ready. I wasn't happy. I wasn't excited, but I was ready. The sound of the jet bridge connecting to the fuselage was a dull, metallic boom. Then came the hissing sound of the seal breaking. The door swung open, and the humid, heavy air of Georgia rushed into the cabin, smelling of jet fuel and rain. 2 uniformed Atlanta PD officers stepped onto the plane. They looked serious, their hands near their belts, their eyes scanning the first-class cabin. Behind them was a man I recognized instantly. David, my chief of security, a man who had been with me since I opened my 3rd office. He was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit, his face unreadable, his eyes searching until they landed on me. The officer in 2C practically tripped over himself to get to the police. "Officers, right here," he shouted, pointing a thick finger at my chest. I'm an off-duty officer myself, and I've been monitoring this individual. He's been non-compliant. He's been filming passengers. And there's a high probability he's traveling with stolen identification and property. The lady here can testify to his erratic behavior. The woman in 2B nodded so hard her earrings jingled. He was digging through a bag that clearly doesn't belong to him. He's been threatening us the whole flight. The 2 APD officers looked at the officer. Then they looked at me. They saw the mud. They saw the hoodie. They saw the tired, middle-aged black man sitting in 2A. They started to move toward me, their faces set in that business-as-usual expression that I've seen 1,000 times. "Sir, we're going to need you to stand up slowly," one of the officers said, his hand resting on the top of his holster. But before they could take another step, David pushed past them. He didn't look at the police. He didn't look at the officer or the woman. He walked straight to my seat and stood at a crisp attention. "Mr. Vance," David said, his voice deep and echoing through the cabin. "I apologize for the delay. The driver is waiting at the curb, and the chairman of the Port Authority is on his way to meet you. We've also been notified of a service incident on this flight. The CEO of the airline has already been briefed and is waiting for your call." The silence that hit the cabin then wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air right out of the room. I saw the officer's hand, which had been pointing at me, slowly start to drop. I saw the smug grin on his face falter, then crumble, then vanish entirely. I stood up. I did it slowly, feeling the ache in my back from the long flight and the long days in the mud. I pulled back the hood of my sweatshirt, exposing my face clearly for the first time. I didn't look like a criminal. I looked like a man who was tired of being told where he belongs. "David," I said, my voice calm and steady. "It's been a long flight. I think these gentlemen were just about to take me into custody." David turned his head just a fraction to look at the two APD officers. "Is there a problem here?" "Officers, Mr. Vance is the owner of Vance Global. He's the primary contractor for the new terminal we're standing in. He also happens to be the largest private donor to the Police Benevolent Fund in this city. Is there a reason you're approaching him with your hands on your weapons?" The two officers froze. I saw the recognition click in their eyes. They'd seen my face on the posters for the charity galas. They'd seen me on the news standing next to the mayor. They looked at each other, then at the officer in 2C, and their expressions turned from enforcers to embarrassed. We were told there was a security threat, sir," one of the officers stammered, stepping back and putting his hands behind his back. "A report from an off-duty officer and a passenger." I turned my gaze to the officer in 2C. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost. His face, which had been so red with anger, was now a sickly, pale gray. He tried to speak, but only a dry, clicking sound came out of his throat. "An officer of the law," I said, stepping into the aisle so I was standing directly in front of him. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. "You spent 4 hours judging me because of the mud on my boots. You assumed that because I didn't look like your version of success. I had to be a thief. You used your authority to try and break a man who was just trying to get home to his family." I looked at the woman in 2B. She had shrunk back into her seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. The purse she'd been clutching so tight was now sitting forgotten on the floor. "And you?" I said, my voice soft but heavy with the weight of the long pain I'd felt all flight. "I hope that bag was worth the fear you chose to live in today. I don't want your apology. I want you to remember this feeling. I want you to remember that the man you were so afraid of is the same man who's building the community center your grandkids might play in one day." The lead purser was standing by the door, his mouth literally hanging open. He tried to step forward, his hands shaking. "Mr. Vance." I had no idea. We were just following protocol based on the reports. Protocol doesn't require you to lose your humanity. I interrupted him. "You didn't see a passenger. You saw a hoodie, and that's a choice you made." I turned to David. "Make sure the airline gets the footage from my phone. I want a full transcript of every word spoken in this cabin sent to the board of directors. And find out which department this officer works for. I think his chief might be interested to know how he represents the badge when he thinks no one is watching." The officer finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, whimpering thing. "Look, man, I was just looking out for the safety of the flight. It's a tense world out there. You know, I didn't mean anything by it." "That's the problem," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You didn't mean anything. To you, I wasn't anything. I was just a profile, a suspicion, a problem. But today, I'm the man who's going to make sure you never do this to anyone else." I walked toward the cabin door, but I stopped for one last second. I turned back and looked at the entire first-class cabin. Some people were looking down at their laps, ashamed. Others were still staring, unable to process the reality of what they were seeing. Success isn't about what you wear. I said, loud enough for the people in the rows behind to hear. It's about what you build. And it's about how you treat the people who are building it with you. Remember that next time you see someone who doesn't fit your room. I stepped out of the plane and onto the jet bridge. The air was thick and warm, and for the first time in 4 hours, I could breathe. I felt the tension leaving my shoulders, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't just Robert Vance, the CEO. I was Robert Vance, the man who had survived the judgment of the world once again. As we walked through the terminal, David stayed a half step behind me. The airport was bustling, people rushing to and fro, most of them never looking twice at the man in the dirty hoodie. And that was fine. I didn't need their eyes. I knew who I was. We got to the curb, and there it was, the black SUV, idling quietly in the rain. The driver held the door open, his face respectful and kind. I climbed into the back seat, the leather cool and soft against my tired legs. I looked out the window as we pulled away from the curb, leaving the airport behind. I thought about the officer. I thought about the woman. I thought about the millions of people who go through what I just went through every single day. But they don't have a David waiting for them. They don't have a CEO title to protect them. They just have to take the humiliation and carry it home. That's why I'm telling you this story. Not to brag about who I am, but to remind you of who we are. We are more than the labels they put on us. We are more than the clothes on our backs or the mud on our boots. We are the architects of our own lives, and no amount of bias can ever tear down what we've built in our hearts. If this story hit you in a place you've been before, do me a favor. Share this. Talk about it in the comments. Let's build a world where we look at the man, not the mask. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. We have a lot more truths to tell, and I want you here for every single one of them. Stay strong, stay proud, and never, ever let someone else's small mind make you feel like you don't belong in the room you built. I leaned my head back against the headrest, closed my eyes, and finally, for the first time in days, I let myself fall into a deep, peaceful sleep as the city of Atlanta flew past the window, a sea of lights shining in the dark. You know, everyone saw that muddy, oversized gray hoodie on that flight and thought they saw a man who had given up. They saw the stains, the frayed cuffs, and the way it hung off my shoulders, and they made a choice to see a nothing. But what they didn't know, what that officer and that woman in 2B couldn't possibly understand, is that I wasn't just wearing a piece of clothing. I was wearing a memory. I was wearing a piece of my soul. Before we get into this, I want to ask you something. Do you have that one thing? That one item of clothing? Or maybe an old watch? Or a worn-out book? That makes you feel like you're still connected to the person you used to be. The person you were before the world told you who you were supposed to be. Drop a comment below and let me know what that anchor is for you. I read every single one of them. To understand why I was in that hoodie on that plane, you have to go back 48 hours before takeoff. I was in a small town outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. It's the kind of place that the maps usually forget. The air there is heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and old industrial rust. It was raining. One of those cold, relentless October rains that soaks through your skin and settles right in your bones. I was there for the Legacy project. My company builds skyscrapers in New York and tech hubs in Austin. But my heart is in the community centers. We were rebuilding an old warehouse, turning it into a sanctuary for kids who didn't have a safe place to go after school. I didn't send a crew. Well, I did, but I went with them. I told my board of directors that I'd be overseeing the site. What I didn't tell them was that I'd be the first one there with a crowbar in my hand. I was working alongside a kid named Terrence. He was maybe 17, with eyes that had already seen too much of the hard side of the street. He looked at me, this guy in a $200 000 car who pulled up and then spent the next 10 hours hauling moldy drywall and rusted pipes, and he didn't trust me. Why would he, in his world, people like me, come to take pictures and then leave before the sun goes down? Why you doing this? Man, he asked me on the second day. We were taking a break, sitting on the back of a flatbed truck, shivering in the damp air. You got people for this. You could be on a beach somewhere. I looked down at my hands. My cuticles were bleeding, and my knuckles were swollen. I reached into my bag and pulled out that gray hoodie. It was buried at the bottom, smelling of cedar and old age. I'd had it for 30 years. This belonged to my father, Terrence. I told him. He wore this every day for 20 years working at the mill. He never made more than $12 an hour, but he never missed a shift. When he passed, this was the only thing he had that felt like him. It's got the sweat of a man who never quit on his family. I put that hoodie on right there in the rain. It was too big for me then, and it's still too big for me now. But the moment the cotton touched my skin, I wasn't the CEO of Vance Global. I was Robert, the boy from the South Side who watched his daddy come home with a broken back and a heart full of love. For the next 2 days, I lived in that hoodie. We worked through the night. We poured concrete in the mud. I slept on a cot in the back of the warehouse for 3 hours a night. I didn't shower. I didn't change. I didn't care. I wanted to feel the weight of the work. I wanted to remember what it felt like to build something with my own 2 hands instead of a signature on a contract. By the time I had to head to the airport for that flight to Atlanta, I was a mess. My jeans were ruined with Ohio clay. My boots were caked in mud. And that hoodie, it was stained with sweat, dust, and the ghosts of my father's struggle. My assistant, Sarah, called me 3 times telling me she'd booked a car to take me to a hotel to change before the flight. No, I told her, I'm going as I am. I wanted to see if the world would still see the man I'd become, or if they'd only see the ghost I was wearing. I wanted to see if the success I'd built was actually part of me, or if it was just a suit I put on in the morning. When I walked into that airport, I felt the eyes. I felt the security guards tensing up. I felt the people in the terminal giving me a wide berth. And for the first time in a long time, I felt invisible. It was a strange, cold freedom. I was a man with $1 billion in the bank, wearing a dead man's sweater, walking through a world that had already decided I was a threat. That hoodie wasn't just clothes. Mon, it was a test for the world, and a test for myself. I wanted to know if I still had the strength to stand in my own truth without the armor of my wealth. So when that woman in 2B looked at me with disgust, she wasn't just looking at a homeless man. She was looking at my father's legacy. She was looking at the mud of a community center that would save 100 kids like Terrence. She was looking at the truth, and she couldn't handle the sight of it. I sat in that seat, feeling the rough cotton against my neck, and I whispered a thank you to the man who gave it to me. I knew the flight would be hard. I knew the looks would come, but I didn't care, because under that muddy, oversized hoodie, I was more of a man than anyone else in that cabin. I closed my eyes as the plane took off, feeling the ghost of my father's hand on my shoulder, telling me that the work was done, and the real test was just beginning. 48 hours. That's how long it took for the world to catch up to the reality of what happened on that flight. I was sitting in my office on the 54th floor, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. The sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows across the mahogany desk that usually made me feel powerful. But today, I just felt heavy. My phone had been buzzing for 2 days straight. The CEO of the airline had called me 6 times. The mayor had sent a personal note. The video I'd recorded on my phone had gone viral. And the officer, whose name I now knew was Miller, was currently the most hated man on the internet. But I wasn't happy. There's no joy in being right when the cost is your dignity. I want to ask you something before I tell you what happened next. If you had the power to destroy the person who humiliated you, to take their job, their reputation, their future, would you do it? Or would you try to build something better from the ruins? Tell me in the comments. I'm still wrestling with the answer myself. There was a knock on my door. It was David, my security chief. He looked at me with that same steady, unreadable expression. "They're here, Mr. Vance," he said. I nodded and stood up. I wasn't wearing the hoodie today. I was back in the armor. A navy blue suit, hand-tailored, and a watch that cost as much as a small house. I caught my reflection in the window. I looked like the world's version of a CEO again, but I felt the ghost of that cotton against my skin. We walked down to the executive boardroom. Waiting for me were 3 men. There was Marcus Thorne, the CEO of the airline, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. There was the police chief of the suburban precinct where Miller worked. And then, in the corner, looking smaller than I ever thought a man could look, was Miller himself. He wasn't wearing his officer persona today. He was in a cheap, off-the-rack suit that was too tight in the shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The woman from 2B wasn't there. She had disappeared into the shadows of her own privilege the moment we landed. But Miller didn't have that luxury. He had a badge, and he had used it as a weapon. "Robert," Marcus said, standing up and reaching out a hand. I didn't take it. I just sat down at the head of the table. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Marcus," I said. My voice was low, the same voice I used on the plane. But here, in this room, it carried the weight of an empire. You have a protocol problem. And Chief, you have a training problem. The police chief cleared his throat. "Mr. Vance, we've already placed Officer Miller on administrative leave. After reviewing your footage and the statements from the crew, we are moving forward with his termination. His behavior was a violation of every code we stand for." Miller flinched. He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw it. The fear, not the "I'm sorry for what I did" fear, but the "I'm sorry I got caught" fear. "I have a family, Mr. Vance," Miller stammered, his voice cracking. "I've been on the force for 15 years. I just thought I was doing the right thing. It's a dangerous world. I was just trying to keep people safe." I looked at him for a long time. The room was so silent, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I thought about the Ceylon pain I'd felt at 30. 0 feet. I thought about the way he'd looked at me like I was a virus in his clean world. "Safety," I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "You think safety is about the color of a man's hoodie? You think authority is the right to humiliate someone who doesn't fit your narrative. You didn't see a threat. Miller, you saw a target." I leaned forward, my shadow falling over the table. "I could sue you into the ground. I could make sure you never work a day in security for the rest of your life. I have the resources to turn your name into a warning for the next 100 years. Miller put his head in his hands. He started to shake. "But," I continued, "that doesn't fix the problem. Taking your job doesn't change the heart of the flight attendant who ignored me. It doesn't change the mind of the woman who clutched her purse. It doesn't change the fact that my son still has to be afraid of men like you. I turned to Marcus, the airline's CEO. I'm not going to sue your airline. On one condition. You are going to implement a mandatory third-party bias training program for every single employee, and you are going to fund a scholarship program for underprivileged youth in the cities you fly to, starting with Cincinnati. Then I looked back at the chief. As for Miller, don't fire him. Not yet. The room gasped. Miller looked up, his eyes wide with a flicker of hope. Place him on unpaid suspension for 6 months, I said. And during those 6 months, he is going to volunteer 40 hours a week at the community center I just finished building in Ohio. He's going to work with Terrence. He's going to haul the trash. He's going to scrub the floors. And he's going to look those kids in the eye every single day. If he finishes the 6 months and Terrence gives me a call saying he's learned something, then he can have his badge back. Miller was sobbing now. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me, I said, standing up. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because I refuse to be the monster you thought I was. I'm doing this because the only way to break the cycle is to show you a world you've spent your whole life trying not to see. I walked out of that boardroom without looking back. David followed me to the elevator. You're a better man than me, Robert, David said as the door slid shut. No, David, I replied, looking at my reflection in the polished brass of the elevator. I'm just a man who knows that a suit can be just as much of a mask as a hoodie. The only thing that's real is what we do when we have the power to destroy. I went back to my office, took off my expensive blazer, and sat in the dark. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out that old, muddy gray hoodie. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then I put it on. The silence was finally peaceful. The gavel had fallen, but instead of breaking something, I truly hoped, it had finally started to build something that would last. Stay strong out there. Y'all, use your power for good, and never forget that the truth always comes out in the end. Hit that subscribe button if you're with me. I'll see you in the next one. I leaned my head back against the headrest, closed my eyes, and finally, for the first time in days, I let myself fall into a deep, peaceful sleep as the city of Atlanta flew past the window, a sea of lights shining in the dark.